So welcome to our little bookseller. Here we are in the year 2025. Wasn't that a hit for Zager and Evans a long time ago? 2025, and we're talking about science fiction. How can this be right? How can it be right? We're living in a science fiction world. Why are we still talking about science fiction? Well, this is the question, isn't it? If you think about the science fiction of, say, 1950, or let's say 1955, then compare it to 1965, there's a big jump. 75, there's a jump again. 85, there's a jump again. Once you get the 90s, think of, say, the science fiction of 1995 and 2005, 2005 and 2015, and 2015 and now. And what you notice is the differences in SF writing, once you get to the 90s, are not so pronounced. Everything is slowed down. But today we're going to talk about non-hauntological matters. There'll be more about that coming up on the channel. Already has been something. I'm going to do some reviews. And am I currently feeling a sense of dissatisfaction with SF? Well, yes, of course, because like anything in cultural production, there's a limit to really good stuff. So I've got a few things to review here. I'm mostly today going to review this book, Skinship by James Reich, who is a friend of mine. Now, of course, the problem with reviewing books by friends is that you know too much and you know too little at the same time. You're not maybe as objective. Sometimes you're too kind. Sometimes you're not kind enough. The whole point, though, is that I know James, we used to work together. We've collaborated on music. We see each other only every few years because he lives in the States. And this is his 7th novel. He's written a number of novels with SF elements. I would say that The Song My Enemies Sing is full-blown SF. There's certainly elements in Soft Invasions, and he's had acclaim from the likes of Barry N. Malzberg and Michael Moorcock, which is great. And James is an educator, writer, journalist, all-round good guy, and he's from England, but he lives, as I say, in the States, in New Mexico. So there we go. And someday I'm going to go over and see him over there. So this is Skinship. I'm going to talk to you about that now. And really, what can we say? Skinship is published by Anti-Oedipus Press, who are the reissuers of Barry Malzberg's Paranoid Astronauts trilogy, because Barry passed away just before Christmas. And I got James into Barry many years ago. And also recently, Anti-Oedipus Press have also published a Norman Spinrad book. So they're good guys. So, you know, get something out there. This is his 7th novel, as I say. And my previous favourite by James is probably a book called Soft Invasions, which he was working on as long as 20 odd years ago. And I remember it in its very nascent sort of stages, and it gradually grew and became something else. And that's the one Michael Moorcock liked. So do watch out for Soft Invasions. It's really good. So Skinship, it's a very good title. You notice how the word kinship is part of the word skinship, and it's a Generation Starship novel. So it's good to see James, who is an experimental modernist romantic novelist, and I mean romantic with a large R, not a small one. And he's influenced by the likes of William S. Burroughs, by Ray Bradbury, Michael Moorcock, lots of sort of really great writers. He's a very well-read chap. So, as I say, it's a Generation Starship novel, so it tackles a classic SF theme. So in terms of his writing so far, this is about as classically SF as it gets. And I know Locus liked it as well, and they described it as one of the most sinister books of 2024. And it's funny because this is where I come across the thing about, because I know James, I don't find it that sinister because I know him really well. So it is that sort of thing. But I guess it is sinister, and you might feel that way about it coming from outside. But as I say, I know him and his work very well. So there we go. What I would say is that a major theme of this book is power. In terms of control systems and people grappling for power. So again, it does remind me of William S. Burroughs, the way that he tackles power in his SF. So skinship, interestingly, is a term that's used a lot in Japan and Korea. And what it actually means is the art of maintaining close physical contact between people to strengthen emotional bonds, particularly between parents and children. And there is a kind of father-son thing going on in this, which we'll come to. So the basic scenario is that over a millennia from now, Earth has been poisoned and is dying, and 3 giant Generation Starships are launched to search for new colony homes to ensure the survival of Homo sapiens. And much of the action of this novel, which is 190 pages long, so it's very taut, which I really like, it's kind of blessed with economy and stylistic flourishes which are characteristic of his high aesthetic style, and is set on one of the starships, which is called the Charcot, and this Generation Starship is bound for the Dragonhead Nebula, and it's a journey that will take some 1500 years for the crew and their descendants. What this doesn't do is go into that classic thing that you get in books like Orphans of the Sky and Non-Stop, where the inhabitants have forgotten that they're on board a starship. He sort of jettisons that, and that's a great thing, but it can be done once or twice really. And he doesn't really go into a lot of world building in terms of the everyday lives of most of the people on board, because it's a very, very big ship, and we'll come on to that later on. But he focuses on a handful of characters. So also, it's interesting in that not only are there people living, reproducing and dying aboard Charcot, but there's an archive of genetic material which is just like drops of blood preserved in a cryogel, and that's on board the ship. And what will happen is that when the Charcot gets to its destination, when it finds a planet in the Dragonhead Nebula, it's going to allow much of the seed of Earth to be cloned up when a suitable colony planet is found, as I say. So really, it's an interesting thing, because again, writers, you know, who are worth their salt will tend to use names and words for specific reasons. And Charcot, interestingly, is a neuropathic condition of the foot and ankle, which to me suggested that the ship itself might have an Achilles heel. And of course it does, and the Achilles heel are the people on board. And this kind of literary symbolism and reference to other work is typical of Reich's typically scholarly and sophisticated approach to narrative. I mean, Anthony Burgess used to do that sort of thing all the time. So, you know, you're in good company here, as it were. So as a condition, Charcot is caused by an inability to sense injuries, which leads to deformity in the foot. So perhaps the Generation Starship gets off on the wrong foot, as it were, as you will see for yourself. So there's perhaps a worm in the apple of this other Eden. So here's the thing, as I say, think about the names, they have specific meanings. If we turn to the key movers in the plot, there's Mon Ami, the archivist, who made me think of the French Mon Ami, my friend, though of course there was a seascape painter called Mon Ami in the 18th century. We also have Applewhite, who is described in the book as a Tommy, which is a kind of reference to the Man Who Fell to Earth, because of course in the Man Who Fell to Earth, it's Betty Jo in the novel, it's Mary Lou in the film, refers to Thomas Jerome Newton as Tommy. That pops up a lot, particularly in Roeg's film. So there's a little sort of reference there. And Applewhite is a construct whose body is recreated numerous times across the 1500-year span of the ship's voyage because it wears out. And his consciousness is transplanted from one incarnation of this android-like body to the next in the form of a chip jacked into the head, a mem card, Reich calls it, and that can be extracted by pulling a ribbon. So Applewhite's identity as a construct is maintained throughout, and that's not supposed to happen. It's supposed to be a different one each time. But Mon Ami, the archivist, has engineered things so that Applewhite continues to have the same character throughout many incarnations. I think they last about 150 years. She has about 10 incarnations across the span of the voyage. So there's definitely some skinship between Mon Ami and Applewhite, sort of father-son sort of thing going on. And it's all part of the archivist's plan, of Mon Ami's plan, to deal with a conspiracy aboard the ship, which has been undertaken by the printers, who are a cabal of 10 who control all the printing on board the ship, all the manufacturing of food, clothing, other goods and artifacts on board the ship. And the ship is big enough to have its own railway system, a metro system. And something that Reich does, he presents an inventive sort of take on this trope, because those who die have their cellular matter integrated into the structure of the skinship, hence its descriptor. So it grows in size to cope with expanding population, which is an issue really tackled in Generation Starship narratives. So there's some very fine verbal imagery employed in here, which reminds me of the kind of poetic approach of people like Samuel R. Delany and M. John Harrison to space opera. And the destination, as I say, is something called the Dragonhead Nebula. And within the nebula, there are two, or nearby, there are two Earth-like planets. exoplanets, which are called Snapdragon and Wormwood, respectively. And of course, Wormwood is from the Bible, from the Revelation of St. John the Divine, and it invokes the star that falls into the bottomless pit, where Abaddon, the angel of the bottomless pit, resides. So there's a certain amount of biblical imagery, and biblical imagery always works really well in SF, I think, because it has a kind of innate power. I'm not so sure if it works as well for people under a certain age, because I think we've seen kind of a schism, particularly in the UK, where people born after a certain date weren't brought up with biblical exegesis and biblical stories. You know, I was very familiar with the Bible as a child. It was read to me and I read it myself, and you know, and I was not a big church attender at all, but I knew the stories as my parents told them me. So, you know, that I think sort of faded away, but it does help for writers to incorporate the way you can, because it does have a real power about it. And you notice this, I'm digressing now, in the way that people respond to the film The Exorcist. People below a certain age don't have the same sort of response to it, because they haven't got that Judeo-Christian thing ground into them when they're young, so they don't find it as frightening. It's a very interesting thing, actually. So going back to the book, there's some really great imagery in it. I mean, there's something that Reich invokes on the sort of bridge of the Starship is a virtual orrery. Well, of course, an orrery is one of those mechanical devices with little sort of planets going around the sun. And of course, there's a virtual one. I've done this in my own fiction. I actually used it in some unpublished. And he does it very, very well and describes the neon of it, the character of neon. And the navigation functions of the ship involve slipping your hands into the deck, and they sort of go into, your fingers go into recesses, which are like if you pick up a bowling ball and your fingers go into the holes in the bowling ball, and there's a kind of milky fluid in there. You manipulate that to navigate and fly the ship, which is fantastic. You know, it's really, really good. So basically what you see is the ornate color of the novel is kind of always there. Now that is a strength, because it's very interesting, because it's a lot more flavoursome than most SF published now. Though I would say occasionally it does get in the way of the content. The style may get in the way of the content. But this is something, even though it's quite fleet, you need to settle back into it and you know, suck in the world is a way to go for it, really. So not only is the crisis going to be coming on the Skinship, there are scenes set back on Earth where a man called Peacock is gathering fuel cells, and this is 1500 years back in time, because he can use them to power a small off-world ship. So can he and his cat escape Earth as it dies? Because of course the Generation Starships haven't taken everybody. So with all the great Generation Starship narratives, there is of course a conceptual breakthrough near the close of the book, which homages the likes of Aldous and Highline, but of course James Wright makes it all his own, which is what he would do. There's flashes of body horror and the inhumanity of Burroughs' Nova Police really sort of come through to me, and they sort of overshadow the book to a degree. But it is its own thing, beginning as a limpid, poetic read, which gradually racks up the tension as the climax begins to coalesce. And despite its brevity, it's not a book that rushes to its conclusion, but it allows the plot to play out in a stately and very nuanced manner. So you get a very well sort of constructed picture plan throughout the plotting. And he peppers the narrative with something that he's very keen on and he's very good at. I mean, if there were any such thing as a countercultural writer anymore, maybe there are one or two. I mean, he's one of them. It's that simple. You know, he has that heritage from the great countercultural writers going right the way back 100 years or more. And that's something which is lacking, I think, these days. And he brings it to life very well. So something that he does, even though you get the commonplace in his work of the countercultural references, and he displays his influences, he does speak in his own voice. So for example, you get occasional descriptions of the character's garb, what they're wearing, which are beautifully incongruous in the manner of those described by Philip K. Dick in Ubik, but without the deliberate absurdity, and they refer to counterculture. And the relationship between the archivist and Applewhite initially seems cloudy, but it sharpens into a spiky relief as the nature of what's going on aboard Charcot becomes clear. So this is satisfyingly pure SF, but it doesn't kowtow to contemporary hard SF cliches, but instead it sort of presents something more thoughtful and nuanced without skimping on the story on plot. And while his style might be too ornate for some, it's a book that demands careful reading, which will ensure it has its own rewards for you. So this is typical of the kind of small press ethos that's at play here, delivering original writing without commercial compromise. Now, in the hands of a larger publisher, editor would have altered this book a lot, almost out of recognition. So that's Skinship. It's out now. You probably buy it on Amazon. You're unlikely to find it in any bookshop. And do support Anti-Oedipus because they're doing some great stuff. So that's a good one to start the year off with, something a bit different that nonetheless takes something traditional and twists it and does something with it. And as I say, the writing, is great. And I can see it as a film. You can see it as a film. And the climax is very exciting. Great stuff. So that was that. So I enjoyed that. Something I didn't enjoy, I enjoyed parts of, is a writer who I really blow hot and cold on. I've got quite a few books by him, and I'm not a completist. I go up to a certain date and I've got pretty much everything, and that's Ian Watson. And this is Slow Birds, which is a short story collection from the early 80s. And J.G. Ballard once said that Ian Watson was the only ideas man in British SF, which was a bit unkind to everybody else. But let's just say it's a Gollanc's Yellow Jacket. And I really blow hot and cold with Ian because he's very spiky, he's very original, there's nobody quite like him. He has amazing ideas, but sometimes I feel the ideas kind of run away with him in the way that Robert Sheckley becomes episodic and loses interest in his plot. Ian sometimes piles on too many ideas, so sometimes he's better in shorter forms. And this is very much a book which a lot of it really didn't do a lot for me. But I want to talk about the title track, Slow Birds. And you've got this image, you imagine a bird flying slowly rather than, defying gravity. But it's actually about sort of cruise missiles. And he refers in the introduction to cruise missiles a few times because this was during the sort of early Thatcher period, just after the Falklands War. So Britain was in a quite jingoistic phase then. And clearly this irked Ian. And Slow Birds is set in a kind of alternate world, which is quite rustic and quite interesting. And the people there are certain parts of the world which have been turned into a kind of glass, because every now and again, slow birds appear. And they're machines, but they move very, very slowly, and they materialize, they move slowly, and they leave behind them these little zones of glass. And people devise this sport, which involves capturing, it's really hard to describe, but it is quite interesting. It involves capturing these missiles and being dragged along by them and kind of skiing around. And it's about somebody who, in a very daft moment, decides to climb on board one. And it's a very rustic rural story. It's very interesting. And they work out that these things are actually from another dimension, from another world. See, there's a phrase we hear a lot, another dimension. What does that actually mean? People say, maybe flying saucer from another dimension. What do they mean by another dimension? Let's get this clear, As I say, I don't want to spend too much time on this because I don't like to slag books off unless I really, really hate them. But this didn't engage me. I don't think I was in the mood for Ian's sort of moments. And I don't know, there's something fussy sometimes about him that I find irritating. Other times I find him really stimulating, but sometimes there's too many ideas for his own good. So I'm not going to say too much about that. At some point I might go back to it and reread some of the stories because I don't think I did it justice. Then a non-science fiction book, a kind of modern classic. This is The Graduate by Charles Webb, which everybody knows the song Here's to You, Mrs. Robinson, and a lot of people have seen, probably more people have seen the film than read the book, with Dustin Hoffman and Anne Bancroft. And of course it's about a young American graduate, early 60s, who gets embroiled in an affair with his father's business partner's wife, and it's supposed to represent the sort of the problems with picket fence America in the 50s and early 60s. And this comes before the big countercultural boom, though the Beat Generation was going on. And what I found really irksome about it is that Benjamin Braddock, who is the central character, he graduates, he's been very successful, there's a part at his house, he doesn't want any part of it, he doesn't know what he wants, and all the way through the book he doesn't know what he wants and he can't articulate it, and that's fine in itself. But the problem is that this book is very unadorned. It has very few stylistic flourishes, it has very little colour, physical description is almost zero, it's set in Los Angeles. There's an awful lot of dialogue. The dialogue is very, very dull. you can see why, when it was optioned for film, people thought, well, yeah, we could get something out of this with really good cinematography and good acting. It could be quite crackling. As a novel, I actually think it's quite weak, and it's interesting got all these other books out to print. There's a Penguin Modern Classic edition, but I really, really was disappointed with this. I found myself growing exasperated with the lack of any clear message as to what was in Benjamin's head, what was going. And of course, that's what it's about. It's about somebody who does know what the problem is, and in that sense, I guess it's kind of successful. But as a read, I found it really, really frustrating. I think it was the fact it was so unadorned. You didn't get the flavour or the colour of the setting at all, and I think that was a shame. It's beautifully designed, but that's definitely going on the sell pile. That's all I have to say for now. So of those three, Skinship easily came out on top. If you fancy a Generation Starship novel, do give it a try, because it is interesting. I'd love to know what you think about it. And the next review video will probably be in about a month's time. There's not going to be much on the channel this month. And, you know, I'll be quite honest about this. The fact is that a lot of people on YouTube don't put much out in January because advertisers are not paying out much money in January because they figure that nobody's buying anything. So you can really flog yourself to death, get a lot of views, but not sort of get much income from it. And I'll be quite honest, that's why I'm doing it. And also, even though I'm going back to work on the 6th, I'm still tired, as you see, and I've been unwell for weeks and weeks and weeks. So I am going to take some downtime. I do have a proper holiday coming up as opposed to sort of sickness. The club room will continue to be one video a week in the club room throughout January, and then in February we'll get back into it, and I hope to make some stuff in January which will come back up in February, spend a bit more time on it. As to the future of the channel beyond that, it's really hard to say. I need to get rid of a lot of books this year. I really cannot accommodate anymore, and I think it's time to slim things down. So I will have some things to say about book hauls and collecting a bit later on in the year. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed that. Check out Skinship if you can. Love to know what you think of it. Also like to know what you think of Ian Watson and The Graduate if you've read it. And I'll see you again soon, I hope. Bye for now.